Hello there, so this is Bhante Ven Rakita Samanera, and also known as Brother Ben. Hello there. So during the course of my training over the previous 11 years, I found that I met many people with personality challenges, and so therefore I found it very useful to familiarize myself with the list of personality disorders in the DSM, and to familiarize myself with the science of psychotherapy and counseling. So to help with this, I found a very good resource in Dr. Todd Grande, who's a licensed counselor and psychotherapist. He's also a lecturer. I have taken a course in Buddhist psychotherapy, a diploma in Singapore with Dot Connections, and have continued to study and increase my awareness of how this psychotherapy applies with the Buddhist teachings and the Dharma, and how mindfulness and secular mindfulness all cooperate and integrate to help us understand the human condition. So today I thought I'd pick one about 10 borderline and bipolar thoughts and behaviors. So we've got the borderline, as it's known, condition, and bipolar condition. So we're going to familiarize ourselves with these, but we're going to be looking at the beliefs and thoughts that drive or are associated with borderline personality disorder, or the kind of thoughts that they have and beliefs that they have, and bipolar disorder people, and what do they think during the time they are with this condition. So that also may not be fixed. So this comes from the resource video that Dr. Todd Grande has created. I don't claim to be a fully qualified licensed counselor or qualified psychotherapist or doctor of psychology. I simply have a vested interest in wanting to understand deeper about that. So first of all, let's have a look at borderline personality disorder, which can be known as BPD, borderline personality disorder. So according to the DSM, this has 9 symptom criteria. 1, frantic efforts to avoid abandonment. 2, non-stable relationship pattern. 3, identity disturbance. 4, impulsivity in 2 areas that are potentially self-damaging. 5, suicidal behavior. 6, affective instability. 7, chronic feelings of emptiness. 8, inappropriate or intense anger or difficulty controlling anger. 9, paranoid ideation or severe dissociation. And with bipolar disorder, at least 1 manic episode that may be preceded or followed by a major depressive episode. So the manic episode, very high mood, and may be preceded or followed by a major deep mood, a low depressive episode. So study used here was with Lee Benjamin Valles Saunders in the study Amy Mohammed Shah Asim 2020. And can we differentiate borderline personality disorder from bipolar disorder? There was another study by Lazarus, Beanie, Howard, Strunk, Pilconis and Chevens in 2019 that was also used. Characterization of relationship instability in women with borderline personality disorder, a social network analysis. personality disorders, theory, research, and treatment. We'll refer to borderline personality disorder as BPD and bipolar disorder simply as bipolar. So let's look at this question then: borderline personality disorder and bipolar behaviors and the thoughts behind them. So he says that in prior videos, we've talked about the differences between these two disorders. They are difficult to differentiate, similar, in addition to that somebody can have both disorders at the same time, so that somebody can have both disorders at the same time, or a diagnosis of one disorder and subclinical symptoms of the other disorder. So what that means is somebody can have the full criteria met for, say, bipolar, but they may have only a few symptoms of borderline. And again, that can confuse things when trying to diagnose these disorders accurately. Distinguishing between the two disorders is important for a number of reasons, including the fact that the treatment protocols are different for each disorder. We see that it's fairly common for somebody with BPD, borderline personality disorder, to receive psychotherapy. For example, they might see a mental health counselor, and it's common for somebody with bipolar to receive psychopharmacological interventions, medicines. So they might see a psychiatrist and receive prescription medications. So in this video, we're really approaching this from the perspective of thinking, of thoughts. Again, in terms of trying to figure out which disorder somebody may have. If we look at certain behaviors or symptoms associated with both disorders, what thoughts would we see with one disorder, and how would those thoughts be different from the thoughts we would expect to see from the other disorder? Now, when we use the term thoughts in this context, like in this video, we're really talking about not only thoughts, but also beliefs. We're also talking about attitudes, and we're talking about expectations. So we want to provide a summary of each disorder here. So this will just be the short version, and there are other videos which cover more comprehensively the entire full range. For borderline personality disorder, we see this as conceptualized as a set of extreme personality traits. So it's a cluster B personality in the same cluster as narcissistic, antisocial, and histrionic personality disorders. The symptoms are often thought as being pervasive, so relatively constant over time. We see there are 9 symptom criteria for this disorder. 1, frantic efforts to avoid abandonment. 2, an unstable relationship pattern. 3, identity disturbance. 4, impulsivity. 5, suicidal behavior. 6, affective instability. So that's mood dysregulation. 7, chronic feelings of emptiness. 8, inappropriate or intense anger or difficulty controlling anger. 9, and paranoid ideation or dissociation. Bipolar disorder is, of course, conceptualized much differently. We see it's conceptualized as a major mood disorder, like major depressive disorder, so it tends to be episodic. We see manic episodes, depressive episodes, and periods in between, which we refer to as euthymia or euthymic phases. That's a state without mood disturbances. So looking at this disorder again, we have the two components, mania and depression. With mania, we see elevated mood, increased goal-directed activities, a lot of energetic, rapid speech, impulsivity, grandiosity, irritability, aggression, poor judgment, difficulty sleeping, and paranoia. With the depressive episode, we see prolonged periods of sadness, somebody sleeping too much or too little, social withdrawal, feeling worthless, having difficulty concentrating, irritability, frustration, anger, and crying for no obvious reason. Now, with both of these disorders, we see cognitive distortions. That's a tendency to look at situations through a distorted lens. One way to think about this would be looking at the difference between emotions and feelings. There are 6 basic emotions: the emotion of sadness, the emotion of happiness, the emotion of disgust, the emotion of anger, the emotion of surprise, and the emotion of fear. Sometimes these emotions are caused by disorders. For example, with bipolar, when somebody's depressed, they tend to be sad, and when they're manic, they tend to be happy. Feelings come about when people assign values to those emotions, and the way people assign values can also be distorted. For example, it's not unusual for an individual with borderline personality disorder to have a marked fear of being abandoned. So they're worried that a romantic interest is going to leave them. Sometimes they believe that this fear indicates that something's wrong with them. So they have this emotion of fear, and then they add this value to it, that they must be worthless. The disorder can also lead somebody to be looking at a situation and misinterpreting it. For example, a romantic partner doesn't call or text on a particular day, so an individual with borderline personality disorder might assume that that person is going to reject them. So we see misinterpretations of emotions and misinterpretations of situations. So distorted thinking doesn't cause someone to have BPD or cause them to have bipolar disorder, but this type of thinking can make the symptoms worse. These distorted thoughts can serve to maintain the disorder. That's why it's useful for counselors to be familiar with these types of thinking and how they're associated with each disorder, and why discussing these types of thought patterns may be helpful in counselling sessions. Now, another area where the examination of thinking can be helpful is for the purpose of diagnosis. Information about actual behaviours and symptoms inform diagnostic decisions more than anything else. But looking at thoughts can reveal nuances that may not be apparent initially. Also, it can be really helpful for a counsellor to better understand the perspective of a client when they know what that client is thinking. It increases the accuracy of empathy, and it's useful for planning the treatment. So, as we get ready to go through this list of behaviours and the thoughts behind them, it's important to note that this is not a comprehensive list. Often people have many thoughts associated with one particular behaviour. And we want to set out kind of how we're structuring this list. we'll start out with a symptom or behavior that's being observed. Now, this could be a symptom that's primarily associated with one disorder that we may see with the other disorder. And some of these symptoms are common with both. So then we'll list one or more thoughts associated with borderline personality disorder, and then one or more thoughts associated with bipolar disorder. Now, with bipolar disorder, we'll also specify whether we're talking about a manic episode or a depressive episode when we list the thoughts, and sometimes list the thoughts for both manic and depressive episodes. So the 10 borderline and bipolar thoughts and behaviors, starting with number 1. The first symptom, this would be intense love. So in borderline personality disorder, this would be the idealization phase within the unstable relationship criterion. So the thoughts for the borderline person would be 1. This love gives me value. Second type, I found somebody who will not reject me. Third kind of thinking, this person will save me. Moving to bipolar disorder, looking at the manic phase. 1, everything is going my way. Second kind of thinking, I feel better than ever. Third kind of thinking, this person is a key part of my plan. So with the bipolar disorder, we really see the connection here to the grandiose thinking associated with the manic phase. The second of the borderline and bipolar thoughts and behaviors, this is the devaluation phase. So again, what we primarily think of as associated with borderline personality disorder, the thoughts here, 1, I know you were planning on rejecting me. And secondly, they had no right to my love. So essentially, we see this as driven by the other person externally. I know you were planning on rejecting me. And the other way, 1, they had no right to my love. So you have the person with borderline personality disorder thinking these thoughts, but they attribute this to an external source. Moving over to bipolar and looking at mania, first, I don't have the patience to deal with this person. So here we see the irritability that is fairly common in the manic phase, especially if the manic phase has been going on for 3 or 4 days. Now, looking at the depressive phase of bipolar, the low, firstly, I just want to be left alone. And secondly, hatred will drive people away. And the third one, I have no energy to deal with people. So we see with depression, there's no patience or energy to contend with relationships. So again, looking at idealization or devaluation on borderline, we see perhaps the same behavior sometimes with bipolar, but for a very different reason. The third kind, of behavior, here we see the anger. So from the borderline personality disorder perspective, this thinking, you are to blame for the way that I feel. So again, we see that the other person is the focus. Right, so there's this external locus of control we see with borderline personality disorder. From the bipolar perspective, looking at mania, first kind of thinking, I have things to do and you're slowing me down. Also, second kind, I have no idea why I'm angry. And this is fairly common with bipolar disorder. So the person is very focused on completing a goal and doesn't want people to get in their way. But also in terms of anger, there's no clear precipitating factor often for people with bipolar disorder. They can't explain why they are angry. They can't offer a theory or a thought as to why that anger occurred. With borderline personality disorder, the person usually does have a theory about what led to that anger. Fourth, looking at behavior number 4. This is the chronic feeling of emptiness. From the borderline personality disorder perspective, first thinking, I will never find peace. Or second kind of thinking, I am unlovable. From the bipolar perspective, specifically depression, I am worthless. So really, we see the thinking is somewhat similar. Moving from borderline personality disorder to bipolar, when it comes to that feeling of emptiness, the fifth kind of behavior is the tendency to engage in self-harm. From the borderline perspective, the first kind of thinking, I feel as though I'm about to be rejected. Second kind of thinking, this is the only way I can feel something. Third kind of thinking, and now people will pay attention to me. From the perspective of bipolar disorder, looking at mania, 1, I'm invincible. Right, so there is a function of feeling powerful and just taking risks. From the depressive episode side, if I'm always going to feel this way, then life isn't worth living. Right, so we see very different views on self-harm. 6, behavior number 6, this is mood swings. That's referred to as affective instability. When we're talking about borderline personality disorder, so from the perspective of borderline, 1, my environment is changing and unstable, so my reaction makes sense. The second kind of thinking, the way people are treating me is causing this. And the third kind of borderline thinking about the mood swings, my feelings are justified. So here we see this idea that the individual with BPD, borderline personality disorder, is really reacting to the environment. They perceive the world as changing around them, and they are simply coping in what they believe is an appropriate manner. From the perspective of bipolar disorder, so looking at mania, the bipolar mood swings, the first thought type, I feel great. And looking at this from the perspective of depression, I feel down. So here we see the recognition that the feeling is coming from the inside. It's being driven by bipolar disorder, and that's not something that's external. Also notice it's very straightforward from the perspective of bipolar disorder. Again, I feel great or I feel down. Right, there's not a complex explanation for it, like we kind of see with the borderline personality disorder thoughts. Behavior number 7, this is resistance to rational thought. We see this with both borderline personality disorder and bipolar disorder. Sometimes when they're working with a counselor, it doesn't seem like they can really be reasoned with. So it's a refusal to appreciate the origin of behavior, a refusal to be treated. We see a lot of resistance here from the borderline personality disorder person perspective. Borderline personalities' resistance to rational thought, for example, I am right and the world is wrong. And another one, my feelings cannot be the enemy here. They must be correct. So this really highlights this theory that with borderline, anyway, feelings contain wisdom. And actually this is fairly common among all of the personality disorders. Thinking, the world doesn't understand how great I feel. Another kind, no one is thinking clearly but me. Again, with the individual with mania doesn't want the world to interfere with their good mood. This is actually remarkably common in the manic phase, and it's important to note here that the psychosis explains the resistance to rational thought. And bipolar disorder. So when we think about how thoughts can maintain or contribute to symptoms, when it comes to psychosis, the thoughts are of the psychotic nature. So it's not like the person with bipolar disorder can necessarily step back from a psychosis and have thoughts about that psychosis. The break from reality drives the thoughts. So that's much different than borderline personality disorder, where somebody might be resistant to treatment, but they can have thoughts about that from a distance. They can recognize that they are resistant to treatment and offer their thinking on that again. With bipolar disorder, the psychosis kind of envelops the person's thinking behavior. So that's the end of that section on resistance to rational thought. Behavior number 8, this is escalation. Right, and we see this with both disorders. The symptoms, at least within a phase, tend to get worse and worse and worse and worse. Like in bipolar disorder, and from time to time can get worse with borderline personality disorder. But either way, we see escalation again in both disorders. So from the perspective of borderline personality disorder, you might be thinking, people don't understand how hurt I am, so I'm going to ramp things up until they understand. So this seems to be rooted in frustration. The individual is not getting their way, and they don't feel like they're being understood. From the perspective of bipolar disorder, looking at mania, escalation in bipolar, I have to achieve more. So this really highlights the progression of an episode. Typically, as mania progresses, the goals become more grandiose, more fantastical, more unrealistic. So there is a progression in essence. The mania usually gets worse, right? So it starts off as a low level of mania and then really progresses. And as that happens, we see an escalation across a broad variety of behaviors. Some of them can be somewhat dangerous, especially to the individual with the disorder. Moving to behavior number 9, this is impulsivity. Now this is an interesting symptom because we see this fairly continually in borderline personality disorder. But we also tend to see this continually in bipolar disorder, even when somebody's not in a manic or depressive phase. So impulsivity is present even during euthymia. Right, so again, that makes it kind of unusual compared to all these other symptoms I've been talking about. So looking at this from the borderline personality disorder perspective, thinking there is no time to waste. And if I act immediately, people will understand how serious I am. Right there, so there's a recognition that they're jumping right into things without really thinking too much about the consequences. With bipolar, looking at mania, thinking, I know exactly what I'm doing. Right, there is a definitiveness to the behavior that we see in a manic phase. When it comes to impulsivity, the decision doesn't appear to be impulsive from that person's perspective. They feel like they have everything sorted out. They know exactly what they're doing, and it's all going according to plan. Again, with mania, we see a euphoria. The individual feels better than they've ever felt before, or better than they often feel. And with that comes an extreme level of confidence. So this takes us to number 10, the last behavior. Here this would be grandiose plans. From the borderline personality disorder perspective, thinking, I have found my true love, or I cannot fail. So this really touches on the narcissistic component that we sometimes see with borderline personality disorder. When looking at narcissistic personality disorder, we know that one of these symptom criteria is fantasies of success and power, and this includes a fantasy of ideal love. Well, this fantasy of an ideal love is also common with borderline personality disorder. Although it's not one of the official symptom criteria, it's just an associated feature. So this really puts more light on this idea that narcissistic personality disorder and borderline personality disorder are in the same cluster. That makes sense in light of these types of similarities between borderline and narcissistic personality disorders. Now moving over to bipolar, looking at the manic phase, they might think everything I touch will turn to gold and losing is not a possibility. Right, so again we see the extreme confidence. This really lines up with grandiosity quite well. So there is a narcissistic component sometimes to mania. A great example of this tendency is the gambling that we often see in the manic phase. So especially as the mania really ramps up, often people will come forward saying things like, well, I'm going to go to the casino, I'm going to gamble and I know I'm going to win big, or I have a system and I can't lose. That's pretty common too. So it's just really an unrealistic level of confidence, kind of extreme grandiosity. Even more so than we typically see with borderline personality disorder. So there are some ideas on borderline and bipolar behaviors and the thoughts that may be driving them or contributing to them. So again, I declare the credit for this, which is completely and utterly all from Dr. Todd Grande. I've simply extracted the content, and it's a way of me to absorb and understand and get into the material more thoroughly so I can deepen my understanding. I have worked here in the Philippines with people who are suffering from borderline, even to the extent of having suicidal ideation and so on. So I have a vested interest in learning deeper this as someone who occasionally has to do counseling and therapy and advising people or listening to people's problems as part of being a Buddhist monk in training. So once again, I am thoroughly grateful for Dr. Todd Grande for providing these videos, which are deeply insightful and very, very helpful to the community at large. This is Bhante Venrakita Samanera, also known as Brother Ben, signing off. May many beings be freed from avoidable suffering.